Hey everybody, Jimmy Smith yet again. This time part 2, because so many people seem to enjoy my Fighters You've Forgotten piece that I did last week. And I'm going to do a part 2 because some names that some people brought up in the comment section that I really liked, that I remember, that I give you some background on as fighters that people forgot. Once again, like, subscribe, leave your own comment. Maybe I'll do one on a fighter that you like, some other subject from my Rolodex of having done this way too long. So anyway, for Forgotten Fighters, there were some really special ones that once again, people had mentioned that I like. We're going to start with, for people who remember, Carlos Newton, former UFC welterweight champion, first Canadian UFC champion. This was a guy who was one of the few who went back and forth between Pride and the UFC back in the day, right before the boom. The interesting thing about Carlos Newton is he was post-Zuffa, pre-boom. He was in this little window, essentially, between the Zuffa purchase of the UFC and his prime was gone by the time the boom happened in 2004. So very interesting window for him because he was in some big shows. He was in some shows that got a lot of attention because of the Zuffa purchase, but he also was kind of done by the time it really became big. Jiu-jitsu guy, submission guy. The reason he didn't have longevity in the sport in the modern era is because he had a very aggressive submission style. He would go for a lot of arm bars from a lot of different positions, had good leg locks. I remember him beating Eric Paulson in Japan. Took him down, mounted him, arm barred him, boom, boom, boom. I mean, just absolutely destroyed him. That was kind of his introduction to the hardcore fans, if you were around back then. And when he came into the UFC, he actually had a run where he was back in the tournament days. He lost in a finale. He beat a guy named Bob Gilstrap, who don't even know who Bob Gilstrap is. And then in the finals, he took on Dan Henderson and lost a decision to Dan Henderson. This is a time when the UFC didn't have very many weight classes. And Carlos was just way too small to be taking on Dan Henderson. Dan Henderson took him down, held him down, beat him up ground and pound, and Carlos couldn't get a submission game going. He was undersized to take on Dan Henderson. That's another thing that you have to keep in mind. In this era, late 90s, early 2000s, we didn't have a lot of weight classes. So if you were really under light heavyweight, it was tough. There was no middleweight division, 185, no welterweight division. So you just fought wherever you could, however you could. And so a lot of fighters, you'll notice, like he fought Dan Henderson, and then he fights Pat Miletich at 170. Like, how? Well, he was a natural 170. He just had to fight a lot heavier because of the restrictions of the weight class at the time. So Carlos bounced around, was really popular in Japan, fought in Pride, fought Kazushi Sakuraba. Joildo Oliveira, a very experienced Brazilian guy, beat him in Pride as well. Lost to Dave Manet, who's a really underrated fighter. I should probably do one on Dave Manet. Then he fought Pat Miletich. And Pat was beating him up. I remember watching this fight live at the time. This was 2001. And Pat is just beating him up on the feet. He's a better kickboxer. Carlos wasn't a bad kickboxer. He wasn't great. And Pat was just beating him up. And they get in a scramble, which is exactly what Carlos Newton thrives in, that kind of environment. He likes moving around, catches him in a bulldog choke, chokes him out. Pat Miletich loses the welterweight title. So the first welterweight champion, who's Pat Miletich, loses to Carlos Condit. It's kind of this new era. He's young, he's good looking, he's dynamic, he's articulate. And Zuffa kind of got behind him in the sense of, this could be a guy that could kind of carry the brand a bit. Then takes on Matt Hughes. Now, an important thing to keep in mind about this Matt Hughes fight is Matt Hughes was always tough, he was always strong, but he was a guy who had difficulties with certain submission guys. Dennis Hallman, most notably, beat him at UFC 29. So a lot of people thought, okay, maybe he has trouble with Carlos Newton. And initially he did. People who forget that fight, this was the famous fight where, I don't know how famous it is now, Carlos Newton gets a triangle, Matt Hughes lifts him up, slams him to get out of the triangle. They're both out. All right? Matt Hughes is out because of the triangle choke. Carlos Newton is out because of the slam. Essentially, Big John McCarthy says Matt Hughes is the winner. This is one of those nowadays that, we didn't have commission fights back then. It was kind of iffy, the rules and everything. You could say they were both out and, it should have been a no contest. Doesn't matter. basically, Matt Hughes doesn't know where he is. He's sitting there. I remember him sitting there like he's out, and they raise it. And he's like, wow, I won. Well, basically, that was a coin flip, and they went with Matt Hughes. Now, that may sound like a robbery, and yeah, you could argue it could have been a no contest. They had a rematch, UFC 38, and Matt Hughes beat him up in London, finished him in round number 4. So this idea that the right guy won, well, they rematched, and Matt Hughes was clearly the better fighter. After that, it's win some, lose some. He doesn't win 2 in a row until the late 2000s, 2009 or something. It is just loss after loss after loss. Carlos Newton, the problem he didn't have longevity is he was a submission guy, but he couldn't really hang with, I remember he lost to Hiroto Sakurai, who has a world-class ground game, lost to a lot of fighters who, Daiju Takase, who's a great Japanese grappler. What happened to Renzo Gracie, he would lose to these guys who just were a bit more versatile than him, who could put pressure on him, and he didn't have a ton of answers. He was one of those guys who, if you were getting in a grappling exchange with him, he could beat you, but when it came to the really serious world-class level jiu-jitsu, he didn't really have that. Lost to Rodrigo Gracie in ADCC, for example, people who follow that. So he was a pioneer, but his prime was just really, really short. Won it in 2001, lost in his first title defense, and never bounced back after that. Bounced around to a lot of different motions, ended up retiring. His final record, 16-14. So a real slide at the end of his career. That was Carlos Newton. So let's go with the guy that Carlos Newton beat, actually submitted him in Pride, Jose Pele Landy Johns. I know it's a long name. It just goes by Pele to most people. The problem with Pele, he was an MMA pioneer, part of the original Shoot the Box camp. He was kind of the original Shoot the Box guy. Before Vanderlei Silva, before the Hua brothers, before all that, we had Pele. The problem with Pele, and I mentioned this in the last video, is if you don't settle down in a big promotion comparatively early, even back in the 90s, early 2000s, it was hard to get a promotional push from anybody. So Pele was very, very good, but Pele bounced around all over the place. He never, when you say, where did you watch Pele? I watched Pele in his prime. God, Warriors War in Kuwait, and I got to do a separate video on the Warriors War. It was a tournament back in the day that had everybody of that era. You know, Warriors War in Kuwait. He fought Macaco in Brazil. He fought, he fought in Japan. He fought in Pride briefly. He just bounced around to a lot of small shows. So he's one of the few guys who kind of made his bones back in the day all over the place, everywhere. And so we know him as a fighter, but he wasn't someone's champion. He wasn't a long-running UFC champ or Pride champ or anything like that. He didn't settle down in any one promotion. So he has a lot of wins over a lot of great guys, including Pat Miletich, UFC champion, knocked out Matt Hughes at Warriors War. He's got a lot of great wins over great guys. Beat Macaco twice, which kind of made his name. But was never a champ for anybody. He never, I can't point to a time in his career when he was the number one guy because he just moved around a little too much. Fought Dave Monet, a bunch of guys of that era. But his prime, once again, was right around the early 2000, 2001, 2002. That's when he started getting a lot of losses and started fading. So by the time most of you got into MMA around 2004-ish for the boom, and I mean most of you as if you're my age, but what I mean is when MMA got on most people's radars, Pele was just past his prime. Why do people like him so much? Imagine a smaller Vanderlei Silva, a lot of knees and flying kicks and crazy stuff and crazy aggressive. And, he had that go, go, go kind of style that was so fun to watch back then. And the difficulty is the UFC he never fought in the UFC. Pride, when he came to Pride, by the time he did, I think he was a little bit past it by then, actually. But he ended up losing to Daijiro Matsui, who was a punching bag in Pride. Everybody beat Daijiro Matsui, and he lost to Daijiro Matsui in 2001. Next fight, he gets submitted by Carlos Newton. No shame in that loss, but, got cut from Pride after 2 losses. So by the time he got to the big show, I think it was a little too late in his career. Lost to Lee Murray, lost to Hanato Babalu, who was a lot bigger. Things like that kind of stalled him at that point in his career, and he never really bounced back on the big show. That's why you may know who Pele is, but you can't tie him to a particular organization. That was the difficulty of Pele. Another name, one of my favorites, Millo Bustamante. out of Brazil. A lot of people don't know who he is because he fought in the UFC very, very early. And the difficulty with that is the first UFC middleweight champion, most people don't know who that is, was Dave Manet. And what Dave Manet did is he beat a fighter named Gil Castillo for the title. Now, then he fought Millo Bustamante, and Millo Bustamante knocked him cold. That was at UFC 35 in the second round in 2002. He had fought Chuck Liddell in the UFC before, and I thought he won that fight. I thought he got robbed. At the awful, terrible, infamous UFC 33 card, it was Chuck Liddell versus Millo Bustamante was one of the fights. And I thought Bustamante outboxed Chuck Liddell the whole time. But ended up, Chuck Liddell getting the decision. Next fight is Dave Manet. He destroys Dave Manet, knocks him out. Then takes on Matt Lindland in kind of an infamous fight for a couple reasons. So what happens is he is better than Matt Lindland in just about every area. He's outboxing him. Has world-class jiu-jitsu. He was a world champion in jiu-jitsu, the first world championships in 96, I believe. He's from my lineage. He's a Carlson Gracie guy. But I've trained with guys who know Murillo and are like, dude, he's unbelievable on the ground. One of the most technical guys out of that early Carlson Gracie camp. He submits Matt Lindland with an armbar. Has it. Done. It's over. Boop. Matt looks like he's rolling, but kind of does this, like he's tapping. Big John McCarthy stops the fight. Matt Lindland protests, and Big John stands him up and starts again. That can't happen today. Remember, this is 2001. The rules are all over the place. But I remember Millo Bustamante looking at Big John like, he tapped. You stopped the fight. It's over. And Big John going, I'm sorry, you got to keep going. And he knocks Matt Lindland down. Matt Lindland tries to scramble back to his feet, gets caught in a guillotine, taps him out again. So what's infamous about that fight is essentially Millo Bustamante beat him three ways. Armbarred him, knocked him down, and then choked him out. So Millo Bustamante was just better. He was the best middleweight in the world at the time. So this is an era where fighters just are leaving the UFC because you can make more money in Japan. I don't know who remembers that. Jens Pover left the UFC. Millo Bustamante left the UFC. BJ Penn left the UFC. A lot of fighters left the UFC in this era to make more money elsewhere. The contracts weren't as restrictive. They couldn't really lock it down like they can now. So he won that fight and bounced for Japan. So the reason you don't know who he is, if you don't know who Millo Bustamante was, is because he left the UFC right in his prime and went to Japan. This was a guy that I think if he had kept going, when I look at that next era, the next champ we have is Evan Tanner. Then we have Rich Franklin. Then we have Anderson Silva. So I think he probably beats Evan Tanner. I think he's better than Evan Tanner. Rich Franklin and him would have been amazing technically. And God, to see prime Millo Bustamante versus prime Anderson Silva would have been incredible. I don't think he outstrikes Anderson Silva. But his ground game was second to none. Who the hell knows? My point is, he really would have been an addition to a really good middleweight division. And the UFC middleweight division wasn't that good at the time. And Millo Bustamante was so far ahead of everyone else that it's kind of a shame he didn't stick around longer. Went to Japan, had mixed success, lost to Quentin Jackson, who was much heavier, lost a controversial one to Dan Henderson, Amar Suluev. So he spent some time in Japan beating, good guys, beat Ikihiso Minowa, for example. Hiroto Sakurai is a pretty good fighter. But you kind of got that feeling that the consistency of his career was gone. That once he went to Japan and had a few losses, he was in and out, and he never really recaptured that prime. Also, he got into it comparatively late. When he won the title, I think in the UFC, I think he's 33. He's in his getting into his mid-30s. So he had a late start in the sport, and I think by the time he really got smoking, he was just a little too old. But it would have been nice to see how he did in the middleweight division because he was so incredibly skilled. Last one, screw it, I'm going to do one more. Probably my all-time favorite fighter when it comes to entertainment value and how far he was ahead of his time, Hiroto Sakurai. Mach Sakurai, you would say in English. But Hiroto Sakurai, at one point in Shuto, and I said before, Shuto, my favorite promotion of all time, he was the Shuto champion at 170 in Japan. At one time, he was 18-0-2. 18 wins, 0 losses, 2 draws. That's incredible, even for that era. Amazing stuff. Beat Frank Trigg, Tetsuji Kato is a good fighter of that time. Beat Kauno in his MMA debut. But Jutaro Nakao, who's a good name back then. But he owned Shuto. And he was fast. He was technical. He had a really good stand-up game. He had everything. Hiroto Sakurai was so much fun. And the first guy to kind of like cartwheel over the guard and do a bunch of crazy Japanese stuff, when he was taking on traditional jiu-jitsu guys. So he's 18-0-2, doing great things. Number 1 welterweight in the world at the time. Rankings were all over the place, depending on what website you went to. But Hiroto Sakurai was the number 1 welterweight, period, end of sentence. Ran into this unknown guy named Anderson Silva. A lot of people forget Anderson Silva was a welterweight first before he made his UFC debut at middleweight. But ran into Anderson Silva, and the problem is Hoto Sakurai had a judo background. He had this maddening habit of trying for the head and arm throw, which is super duper dangerous in MMA. He went for a head and arm on Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva popped his head out, took his back with his long legs, and just beat the crap out of Hiroto Sakurai. Just beat the piss out of him. And this was for the Shuto title. This was in 2001 in Japan. Beat him up, won a unanimous decision, kicked the crap out of him. After that, went to the UFC, actually. Back in the day, every now and then they would bring in somebody from another promotion to fight for a title. He fought Matt Hughes. He lost by TKO in round number 4. After that, it's up and down. Does have some wins, but, loses to Jake Shields, goes down to 155. Has some success, by the way, in Pride. Beat Jens Pulver, beat Shinya Aoki, beat Hellboy Hansen, lost to Gomi in the Pride Shockwave final, I think it was 2005. So it does have some good wins over some good guys. But the problem with Hoto Sakurai is he's just an undersized welterweight, right? One of the issues why a lot of Japanese legends didn't do great after, let's say, 2001-ish is the weight classes just outgrew them, meaning I'm a welterweight, Hoto Sakurai. No, you're not. You're a 155-pounder, really. And we started taking on those big Americans, especially the wrestlers like Matt Hughes, Jake Shields. He couldn't compete with those guys. He just got manhandled. And so went down to 55, had some success there, but by the time he did that, he's later on in his career, he's been through some lumps, and he could never establish himself as like the number 1 guy at 55. In his prime, I think he probably could have, but he spent his prime at 170. So one of the reasons you see a lot of Japanese fighters and Pride fighters or whatever not make inroads in the UFC is, being a welterweight-sized fighter in Japan is very different than being a welterweight-sized fighter in the U.S., where you're dealing with a skill set where wrestlers are really good at cutting weight. And Hiroto Sakurai wasn't able to do that. By the time, like I said, he gets to 55, it's later on in his career, and he didn't have enough gas in the tank. But man, a prime Hiroto Sakurai, so fun to watch. Go on YouTube. Check it out. Anyway, there are a few more fighters that you probably don't remember now that had great histories. Let me know if you want to see any more, and I'll see you soon.